In the small village of Bondoki, Burkina Faso, a baby boy cried his first breath in 1988. His parents named him Ibrahim Traore. They were simple farmers who worked hard every day just to feed their family. Like most people in their village, they were poor, very poor, but they had big dreams for their son. Ibrahim's father often told him stories about their country's past. Long ago, he would say, our land was rich and free. We had gold in our soil and proud warriors who protected our people. But now, the old man would shake his head sadly. Today, other countries take our gold, and our leaders do nothing to stop them. As a young boy, Ibrahim watched French trucks drive through his village. These trucks were heavy with gold dust from the mines nearby. The gold was going to France, but the people of his village remained hungry. This confused the young boy. "Papa," he asked one day, "if we have so much gold, why are we still poor?" His father looked down at him with tired eyes. "Because, my son, our leaders care more about making foreigners happy than helping their own people." This answer planted a seed in Ibrahim's mind, a seed that would grow into something powerful. When Ibrahim turned 18, he made a decision that surprised his family. Instead of becoming a farmer like his father, he joined the military. His parents were worried. The army was dangerous, and they feared they might lose their son. But Ibrahim had a plan. He wanted to learn how to fight and how to lead. He believed that one day, someone would need to stand up for Burkina Faso. In military school, Ibrahim was different from other young soldiers. While they partied and joked around, he studied. He read books about African history and learned about leaders who had fought for their people's freedom. He discovered that many African countries had the same problem as Burkina Faso. Their natural resources were being taken by foreign companies, while their people stayed poor. Ibrahim quickly became known as a smart and brave soldier. His commanders noticed that other soldiers respected him. When he spoke, people listened. When he gave orders, people followed them without question. But what made Ibrahim special was not just his leadership skills. It was his deep love for his country and his people. By the time he reached the rank of captain, Ibrahim had seen enough to make him angry. He had watched politicians sign deals that gave away Burkina Faso's resources for almost nothing. He had seen how foreign soldiers were brought in to fight terrorists, but these foreign troops seemed more interested in protecting mines than protecting villages. One night, while sitting with fellow officers in the military base, Ibrahim said something that would change everything. "We cannot keep waiting for our leaders to grow a backbone," he told them. "If we want real change, we must create it ourselves." Some of the older officers laughed at him. "You are too young to understand politics," they said. "This is how things have always been done." But the younger soldiers did not laugh. They had grown up seeing the same problems Ibrahim had seen. They were tired of watching their country being controlled by others. Slowly, quietly, these young soldiers began to gather around Ibrahim. They started meeting in secret, talking about their dreams for a free Burkina Faso. Ibrahim was careful. He knew that if the wrong people learned about their meetings, they could all be arrested or worse. But he also knew that doing nothing was not an option. Every day that passed meant more gold leaving their country, more foreign control, and more suffering for their people. As the months went by, Ibrahim's group grew larger. They called themselves the Patriots. They studied successful revolutions in other countries and learned about military strategy. Most importantly, they prepared for the day when they would have the courage to act. That day was coming sooner than anyone expected. The 34-year-old captain who had grown up watching French trucks steal his country's gold was about to shock not just Burkina Faso, but the entire continent of Africa. The boy who had asked his father why they were poor despite having gold was about to find his own answer to that question. The clock showed 11:30 p.m. on September 29, 2022. Captain Ibrahim Traore sat in his small room at the military base, staring at a map of Burkina Faso's capital city. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from excitement. Tonight was the night he and his patriots had been planning for months. Earlier that day, President Paul Henry Damiba had given another speech promising to fight terrorism and bring peace to the country. But Ibrahim knew these were just empty words. For 9 months, Damiba had been in power after his own military coup, but nothing had really changed. French soldiers were still in the country. Foreign companies were still taking their gold. People were still dying from terrorist attacks every week. "Captain," whispered Lieutenant Ouedraogo, one of Ibrahim's most trusted patriots, "the men are ready. All units are in position." Ibrahim looked around the room at the 12 young officers who had chosen to follow him. Some were barely 25 years old. Others, like himself, were in their 30s, but they all shared the same dream: a truly free Burkina Faso. "Remember," Ibrahim told them, his voice calm but serious, "we are not doing this for power or money. We are doing this for every child who goes to bed hungry while foreigners get rich from our gold. We are doing this for every farmer whose village has been attacked while foreign soldiers protect only the mines." At exactly midnight, Ibrahim gave the signal. "For Burkina Faso," he said quietly. What happened next was like something from a movie, but it was completely real. Ibrahim's patriots moved through the dark streets of Ouagadougou like shadows. They had planned every detail perfectly. Some groups went to the national television station. Others headed to the presidential palace. A third team secured the airport to make sure no one could escape the country. The most important target was the presidential palace where Damiba was sleeping. Ibrahim himself led this mission. As they approached the palace gates, the guards were surprised to see military vehicles arriving so late at night. They recognized Captain Traore and his men as fellow soldiers, so they did not suspect anything unusual. "Open the gates," Ibrahim ordered confidently. "We have urgent security business with the president." The guards, thinking this was a normal military operation, opened the gates without question. Within minutes, Ibrahim and his men had taken control of the entire palace. They moved quickly through the corridors, securing every room and every exit. When they reached President Damiba's bedroom, Ibrahim knocked politely on the door. "Mr. President," he called out, "please come out. We need to talk." Damiba emerged in his pajamas, confused and frightened. He could not believe that young Captain Traore, a man he had trusted, was standing in his bedroom with armed soldiers. "Captain, what is the meaning of this?" Damiba demanded, trying to sound brave. Ibrahim looked at the man who had promised so much but delivered so little. "Mr. President," he said respectfully but firmly, "your time is over. The people of Burkina Faso deserve better leadership." By 3 a.m., all key locations in the capital were under Ibrahim's control. The operation had been completed without a single shot being fired. No one had been hurt. This was exactly what Ibrahim had wanted. He was not interested in violence or revenge. He only wanted change. As the sun rose on September 30, 2022, Ibrahim walked into the national television station. He was still wearing his military uniform, but now he looked different. He looked like a man who had just changed the destiny of his country. The television cameras started rolling. Across Burkina Faso, people turned on their TVs and radios to see what was happening. They saw their young captain standing straight and tall, ready to speak words that would shock not just his own country, but the entire African continent. Ibrahim Traore was about to become the youngest head of state in Africa. More importantly, he was about to declare war on a system that had kept Africa poor for decades. 3 months had passed since Ibrahim Traore's coup in Burkina Faso. Across West Africa, powerful men were getting very nervous. These were presidents and generals who had ruled their countries for many years. They had grown rich and comfortable by following rules set by Western countries, especially France. Now, this young captain from a small African country was making them look bad. Worse than that, he was giving their own people dangerous ideas about freedom and independence. On a hot January evening in 2023, expensive black cars began arriving at the Golden Tulip Hotel in Accra, Ghana. The cars had dark windows, so nobody could see who was inside. But if people had looked carefully, they would have seen some of the most powerful men in West Africa stepping out of those vehicles. The hotel's top floor had been booked completely for a private business meeting. Heavy security guards stood at every entrance. Even the hotel staff were told to stay away from that floor. What was about to happen in that room was meant to be secret forever. At exactly 8 p.m., 12 men sat down around a large wooden table in the hotel's most expensive conference room. These were not ordinary men. They were presidents, prime ministers, defense ministers, and military commanders from across West Africa. Each one controlled millions of people and billions of dollars. At the head of the table sat General Sékou Kounet from Guinea. He was 67 years old and had been in power for over 20 years. His face was hard and angry as he looked around the room at the other powerful men. "Gentlemen," General Sékou began, his voice deep and serious, "we have a big problem. This boy, Ibrahim Traore, is making all of us look like fools." President Alassane Ouattara's representative from Ivory Coast nodded his head in agreement. "Our people are starting to ask questions they should not be asking," he said. "They want to know why we still have French military bases in our countries. They want to know why French companies control our cocoa and coffee exports." Defense Minister Abdoulaye Magasuba from Mali spoke next. "Just last week, students in Bamako held protests supporting Traore. They were carrying signs saying Mali should follow Burkina Faso. This is very dangerous for all of us." Around the table, other leaders shared similar stories. In Senegal, young people were organizing meetings to discuss Traore's speeches. In Niger, university students were demanding that their government kick out foreign military bases. In Ghana, opposition parties were using Traore's example to criticize the current government. "The worst part," said General Sékou, banging his fist on the table, "is that this Traore boy is making our people believe they can actually change things. For 50 years, we have taught them to accept their situation. Now he is telling them they deserve better." The room fell silent for a moment. These men had spent decades building a system that kept them in power and kept their people quiet. They had learned how to balance the demands of their foreign partners with just enough promises to their own citizens to avoid serious trouble. But Ibrahim Traore was destroying that careful balance. He was showing ordinary Africans that their leaders could actually say no to foreign powers. He was proving that African countries could make their own decisions about their own resources. "I received 3 phone calls from Paris this week," admitted the representative from Burkina Faso's neighbor, Ivory Coast. "The French are very unhappy about what Traore is doing. They say if we don't control this situation, it could spread to other countries." "It is already spreading," replied General Sékou grimly. "My intelligence sources tell me that young military officers in at least 5 countries are studying what Traore did. They are asking themselves why they should not try the same thing." The men around the table looked at each other with worried faces. They had not expected one young captain from a small country to create such big problems for them. "So what do we do?" asked the youngest man in the room, a defense minister from Togo. General Sékou smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "We remind Captain Traore and everyone watching him that there are rules in this part of Africa. And those rules exist for very good reasons." 2 weeks after the secret meeting in Accra, the people of Burkina Faso woke up to something they had never seen before. A convoy of 6 black SUVs was driving slowly through the streets of Ouagadougou, heading straight for the presidential palace. Each vehicle had small flags from different West African countries. Inside these cars sat 3 of the most feared military commanders in West Africa. General Sékou Kounet from Guinea was in the lead car, wearing his full military uniform with dozens of medals covering his chest. Next to him sat General Amadou Hayasanogo from Mali, a man known for crushing rebellions without mercy. In the third car was Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, also from Guinea, whose reputation for dealing with troublemakers was known across the continent. These were not ordinary visitors. They were men who had ruled with iron fists for decades. They had crushed student protests, silenced opposition leaders, and made deals with foreign powers that made them very rich. Now they were coming to teach a young captain a lesson about respect and obedience. At the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traore was having his morning meeting with his advisors when his security chief rushed into the room. "Mr. President," the security chief said, looking worried, "we have 3 very important visitors demanding to see you immediately. They say it cannot wait." Ibrahim looked up from the reports. He was reading about new schools being built in rural villages. "Who are these visitors?" he asked calmly. "General Sekou from Guinea, General Sanogo from Mali, and Colonel Doumbouya. They came with no advance notice, and they look very serious." Ibrahim's advisors began to whisper nervously among themselves. Everyone knew who these men were. They were legends in military circles, but not the good kind of legends. They were the kind of men who made other men disappear when they became too troublesome. "Send them to my office," Ibrahim said quietly, "and make sure we serve them good coffee. Even unwelcome guests deserve proper hospitality." 30 minutes later, the 3 generals walked into Ibrahim's simple office. They expected to find a luxurious room with expensive furniture and golden decorations, like the offices of other African leaders they knew. Instead, they found a modest room with simple wooden furniture and photographs of Burkina Faso's villages on the walls. Ibrahim stood up to greet them, showing proper respect for their age and experience. But the generals did not return his politeness. General Sekou walked straight to Ibrahim's desk and placed a thick folder on it with a loud thud. "Captain Traore," General Sekou said, his voice cold and threatening, "we are here on behalf of the West African Leadership Council. This document contains instructions that you will follow immediately." Ibrahim looked down at the folder, but did not touch it. "What kind of instructions?" he asked. "First," said General Sanogo, counting on his fingers, "you will stop all anti-French activities immediately. Second, you will invite French military advisors back into your country. Third, you will cancel all agreements you have made with Russia and China. Fourth, you will apologize publicly for the trouble you have caused to regional stability." Colonel Doumbouya stepped forward, trying to look intimidating. "You have exactly 48 hours to comply with these demands. If you refuse, there will be serious consequences for you and your country." The 3 generals stood there expecting Ibrahim to be frightened. They had used similar tactics on other young leaders before, and it always worked. African military officers were taught to respect their elders and follow orders from senior commanders. But as they watched Ibrahim's face, they realized something was different about this young captain. His eyes were calm, almost peaceful. He was not sweating or shaking like other men they had threatened. Instead, he seemed to be thinking deeply about something. "Is there anything else?" Ibrahim asked politely. "We expect your answer in 48 hours, General Sekou repeated. "Do not make the mistake of thinking you can stand alone against all of us." Ibrahim smiled slightly. "Thank you for visiting my country. I hope you enjoy the coffee." The next 48 hours felt like the longest 2 days in Burkina Faso's history. News of the general's visit had spread quickly through the capital city. People gathered in small groups on street corners, whispering about what might happen to their young president. Many were scared that Ibrahim would give in to the pressure, just like so many African leaders had done before. In the presidential palace, Ibrahim's advisors were having heated discussions about what he should do. Some urged him to compromise with the generals. "They have armies and money," argued his finance minister. "We are just one small country. How can we fight against all of them?" But others supported standing firm. "If we give in now," said his defense minister, "we will never be truly free." This is exactly the test we knew would come someday. Ibrahim listened to all the arguments, but he had already made his decision. He spent the 2 days visiting villages outside the capital, talking to farmers and workers. He wanted to hear what ordinary people thought about the situation. In the village of Kaya, an old woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Mr. President," she said, "my son died fighting terrorists while French soldiers stayed safe in their bases, protecting only the gold mines. Please do not let those men force you to bring the French back." In another village, a young teacher told him, "For the first time in my life, I am proud to be from Burkina Faso. You have shown the world that we are not afraid. Please do not change now." These conversations strengthened Ibrahim's resolve. When he returned to the capital on the second day, he called a meeting with his closest advisors. "I have made my decision," he announced. "Tomorrow morning, I will give the generals my answer." The next morning, the three generals returned to the presidential palace at exactly 10 a.m. They walked into Ibrahim's office with confident smiles, expecting to hear his surrender. General Sekou had even prepared a statement for Ibrahim to read on television, announcing his compliance with their demands. "Well, Captain," General Sekou said, settling into his chair, "we hope you have made the wise choice." Ibrahim stood up from behind his desk and walked to the window. He looked out at the busy streets where his people were going about their daily lives, trusting him to protect their future. When he turned back to face the generals, his expression was completely calm. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have given your ultimatum careful consideration." The generals leaned forward, ready to hear his acceptance of their terms. "And my answer is no." The word hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. The three generals stared at Ibrahim in complete shock. No one had ever said no to them before. "Excuse me," General Sekou stuttered, not believing what he had heard. Ibrahim walked back to his desk and picked up the folder containing their ultimatum. Very slowly, while maintaining eye contact with General Sekou, he tore the document in half. Then he tore it in half again. And again. The pieces of paper fell to the floor like confetti. "Burkina Faso will never again bow to threats from anyone," Ibrahim said, his voice steady and strong. "Whether those threats come from Paris, Washington, or from fellow Africans who have forgotten what it means to serve their own people." The generals' faces turned red with rage and embarrassment. General Sanogo stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. "You have no idea what you have just done," he shouted. "I know exactly what I have done," Ibrahim replied calmly. "I have chosen my people over your approval. I have chosen freedom over fear." Colonel Doumbouya pointed his finger at Ibrahim threateningly. "You will regret this decision for the rest of your life." Ibrahim walked to his office door and opened it. "The rest of my life will be spent serving Burkina Faso's people, not foreign interests. Now, I believe our meeting is over." As the three generals stormed out of the palace, they knew that everything had changed. The young captain had just declared war on the entire system they had spent decades building. Within hours of the general's angry departure from Burkina Faso, phone calls were being made across West Africa. But these calls were not coming from the old guard who had tried to intimidate Ibrahim. Instead, they were coming from younger military officers who had been quietly watching the drama unfold. The first call came from Bamako, Mali. Colonel Assimi Goïta, who had led his own military coup in Mali 2 years earlier, was on the line. "Captain Traore," he said, "what you did today took real courage. Mali stands with Burkina Faso." The second call came from Niamey, Niger. General Abdourahmane Tiani, who commanded Niger's presidential guard, spoke carefully but clearly. "We have been watching your example closely. Perhaps it is time for all of us to work together." Over the next few weeks, something unprecedented began to happen across the Sahel region of Africa. Young military leaders who had taken power in their countries started coordinating their policies. They had all faced similar pressures from Western powers and their own regional neighbors. They had all been told to stay in line and follow the old rules. But Ibrahim's defiance had shown them that there was another way. In March 2023, Ibrahim traveled secretly to Bamako for a meeting with Colonel Goïta. The two men sat in a simple room in Mali's presidential palace, sharing ideas about how their countries could work together. "The French have been playing us against each other for decades," Colonel Goïta explained. They tell Mali one thing and Burkina Faso another thing. They make us compete for their approval instead of working together for our people's benefit. Ibrahim nodded in agreement. What if we stopped competing and started cooperating instead? This conversation led to more secret meetings. In April, leaders from Niger joined the discussions. By May, they had formed a new alliance called the Alliance of Sahel States. Their goal was simple: to work together to defend their sovereignty and develop their countries without foreign interference. The alliance's first major decision shocked the international community. All three countries announced that they were withdrawing from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, the regional organization that had been used to pressure them. ECOWAS has become a tool for foreign powers to control African countries, Ibrahim announced at a joint press conference with his new allies. We choose to work with partners who respect our sovereignty, not those who try to dictate our policies. The alliance also announced joint military operations against terrorist groups that had been attacking all three countries. Instead of relying on French or American military support, they would pool their resources and share intelligence to protect their own people. Most importantly, they began coordinating their economic policies. They negotiated as a group with countries like Russia, China, and Turkey for new trade deals and investment projects. This gave them much more negotiating power than they had as individual small countries. The old guard of African leaders watched these developments with growing alarm. General Sékou called an emergency meeting of the same group that had met in Accra. This alliance is becoming stronger every day, he told the other leaders. If we do not stop them now, other young officers in our own countries might get similar ideas. But it was already too late. The alliance was growing not just in strength, but in popular support. Across West Africa, young people were watching the Sahel states with admiration and hope. In Ghana, university students organized rallies supporting the alliance. In Senegal, opposition parties demanded that their government follow the Sahel example. In Nigeria, youth groups began questioning why their country still had so many foreign military bases. The boy who had asked his father why they were poor despite having gold had not only found his answer, he had inspired a whole generation of Africans to start asking the same question. The response from the established African leaders came swiftly and brutally. On June 15, 2023, the Economic Community of West African States held an emergency meeting in Abuja, Nigeria. The room was filled with presidents, prime ministers, and their representatives, all united by one goal: to crush Ibrahim Traore and his alliance before their ideas spread further. President Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, who was also the chairman of ECOWAS, stood at the podium with a stern expression. The actions of these three countries threaten the stability of our entire region, he declared. We cannot allow a few reckless young men to destroy decades of progress and cooperation. What followed was the harshest set of economic sanctions ever imposed by African countries on other African nations. All banks in ECOWAS member countries were ordered to freeze accounts belonging to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Trade borders were closed immediately. Airlines were banned from flying to or from the three alliance countries. Diplomatic relations were suspended. The goal was clear: to strangle the economies of the three countries until their people turned against their leaders. Within 6 months, predicted General Sékou confidently, their economies will collapse and their people will beg for these sanctions to be lifted. International media began reporting that the Sahel Alliance was heading toward economic disaster. Western analysts predicted mass starvation and civil war. Some newspapers wrote that Ibrahim Traore's experiment would soon end in complete failure. But Ibrahim had been preparing for exactly this scenario. During the months since his coup, he had quietly built alternative systems that could function without ECOWAS support. They think they can starve us into submission, Ibrahim told his advisors during an emergency meeting. But they have forgotten that Burkina Faso survived for thousands of years before ECOWAS existed. The first solution came through the alliance itself. When traditional trade routes through Ghana and Ivory Coast were blocked, The three countries created new routes through each other's territories. Goods from Burkina Faso could now reach the sea through Niger, bypassing hostile neighbors entirely. The second solution came from new international partnerships. Russia quickly offered to replace Western banks with Russian financial institutions. China provided emergency loans to keep essential services running. Turkey opened new trade agreements that gave the alliance access to European markets without going through traditional African middlemen. Most importantly, Ibrahim launched a massive program to make Burkina Faso more self-sufficient. "For too long, we have depended on others for things we can produce ourselves," he announced on national television. Burkina Faso began producing more of its own food instead of importing rice and wheat from other countries. Local factories started making basic goods that had previously been imported. Young people were trained in technical skills to reduce dependence on foreign experts. The gold mines, which had been controlled by foreign companies for decades, were gradually brought under national control. "Our gold should benefit our people first," Ibrahim declared, "not foreign shareholders." Within 3 months, something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, Burkina Faso's economy began to stabilize. People were eating locally grown food, wearing locally made clothes, and working in locally owned businesses. More importantly, they were proud. For the first time in decades, ordinary citizens felt that their country was truly working for them. When General Sékou received reports about these developments, he could not believe them. "How is this possible?" he demanded from his intelligence officers. "The sanctions should have destroyed them by now." The answer was simple but profound. When a country's leaders genuinely serve their people instead of foreign interests, the people will endure any hardship to support those leaders. In villages across Burkina Faso, farmers donated extra food to feed city workers. In the cities, professionals volunteered their time to help with development projects. Young people organized community work groups to build roads and schools without waiting for government funding. The economic war that was supposed to destroy Ibrahim Traore was instead making Burkina Faso stronger and more united than it had been in generations. By September 2023, exactly 1 year after Ibrahim Traore's coup, something was happening across Africa that no one had predicted. The Traore effect was spreading like wildfire, inspiring young people in countries far beyond West Africa. It started with university students in Nigeria. Despite their government's support for sanctions against Burkina Faso, thousands of Nigerian youth took to the streets of Lagos and Abuja. They carried signs reading "Nigeria needs a Traore" and "End neo-colonial dependency now." The protests spread quickly to other countries. In Kenya, students at the University of Nairobi organized lectures about economic independence, using Burkina Faso as a case study. In South Africa, young people began questioning why international companies still controlled most of their country's mining industry. But the most shocking uprising happened in Senegal, one of France's most loyal allies in West Africa. President Macky Sall had been one of the strongest supporters of sanctions against Ibrahim's alliance. He had publicly criticized the Sahel leaders as dangerous radicals. But Senegalese youth saw things differently. In October 2023, over 100,000 young people gathered in Dakar's Independence Square for what they called the March for True Independence. They demanded that President Sall follow Ibrahim's example by reducing French influence in their country. "We want a president who serves Senegal, not France," shouted Aminata Diallo, a 23-year-old university student who had become one of the protest leaders. "If a small country like Burkina Faso can stand up to foreign powers, why can't we?" The protests in Senegal lasted for weeks. President Sall ordered police to disperse the crowds, but the young people kept coming back. They organized peaceful sit-ins, distributed leaflets explaining how foreign companies were taking Senegal's resources, and used social media to spread their message across the continent. Similar scenes played out in Ghana, where thousands of young people demanded an end to foreign military bases. In Ivory Coast, youth groups organized boycotts of French companies. In Cameroon, students held rallies supporting the Sahel Alliance. Even in countries outside West Africa, the movement was growing. In Democratic Republic of Congo, young people began questioning why foreign companies controlled their cobalt mines, while most Congolese remained poor. In Tanzania, youth activists demanded greater control over their country's gold exports. The established leaders were panicking. President Sall called an emergency meeting with other ECOWAS heads of state. "This madness has to stop," he told them. "If we don't control these protests, we could all lose power." But controlling the protests was becoming impossible. The young people were not just angry about their current conditions. They were inspired by a vision of what Africa could become. Ibrahim Traore had shown them that African countries could make their own decisions, control their own resources, and chart their own course toward prosperity. Social media played a huge role in spreading the movement. Videos of Ibrahim's speeches were shared millions of times across the continent. Young Africans created online forums to discuss economic independence and compare their country's situations with Burkina Faso's progress. The most popular video showed Ibrahim speaking to a group of farmers about food security. "Every grain of rice we import is a grain we could have grown ourselves," he said. "Every job we give to foreign companies is a job we could have given to our own people." This message resonated with young Africans who had grown up watching their countries export raw materials while importing finished goods. They began to understand that political independence meant nothing without economic independence. By the end of 2023, the Continental Uprising had reached a tipping point. Even some government officials in various countries were privately expressing support for the Sahel Alliance's approach. In Ghana, several parliament members publicly questioned their government's support for sanctions against Burkina Faso. In Nigeria, state governors began visiting the Sahel countries to explore trade opportunities despite federal government disapproval. The boy from Bondoki village, who had once asked why his country was poor, despite having gold, had accidentally triggered the largest youth movement in Africa since the independence struggles of the 1960s. Part 9. The New Dawn of African Leadership. By September 2023, exactly 1 year after Ibrahim Traore's coup, something was happening across Africa that no one had predicted. The Traore effect was spreading like wildfire, inspiring young people in countries far beyond West Africa. It started with university students in Nigeria. Despite their government's support for sanctions against Burkina Faso, thousands of Nigerian youth took to the streets of Lagos and Abuja. They carried signs reading, "Nigeria needs a Traore," and "End neo-colonial dependency now." The protests spread quickly to other countries. In Kenya, students at the University of Nairobi organized lectures about economic independence, using Burkina Faso as a case study. In South Africa, young people began questioning why international companies still controlled most of their country's mining industry. But the most shocking uprising happened in Senegal, one of France's most loyal allies in West Africa. President Macky Sall had been one of the strongest supporters of sanctions against Ibrahim's alliance. He had publicly criticized the Sahel leaders as dangerous radicals. But Senegalese youth saw things differently. In October 2023, over 100,000 young people gathered in Dakar's Independence Square for what they called the March for True Independence. They demanded that President Sall follow Ibrahim's example by reducing French influence in their country. "We want a president who serves Senegal, not France," shouted Aminata Diallo, a 23-year-old university student who had become one of the protest leaders. "If a small country like Burkina Faso can stand up to foreign powers, why can't we?" The protests in Senegal lasted for weeks. President Sall ordered police to disperse the crowds, but the young people kept coming back. They organized peaceful sit-ins, distributed leaflets explaining how foreign companies were taking Senegal's resources, and used social media to spread their message across the continent. Similar scenes played out in Ghana, where thousands of young people demanded an end to foreign military bases. In Ivory Coast, youth groups organized boycotts of French companies. In Cameroon, students held rallies supporting the Sahel Alliance. Even in countries outside West Africa, the movement was growing. In Democratic Republic of Congo, young people began questioning why foreign companies controlled their cobalt mines, while most Congolese remained poor. In Tanzania, youth activists demanded greater control over their country's gold exports. The established leaders were panicking. President Sall called an emergency meeting with other ECOWAS heads of state. "This madness has to stop," he told them. "If we don't control these protests, we could all lose power." But controlling the protests was becoming impossible. The young people were not just angry about their current conditions. They were inspired by a vision of what Africa could become. Ibrahim Traore had shown them that African countries could make their own decisions, control their own resources, and chart their own course toward prosperity. Social media played a huge role in spreading the movement. Videos of Ibrahim's speeches were shared millions of times across the continent. Young Africans created online forums to discuss economic independence and compare their country's situations with Burkina Faso's progress. The most popular video showed Ibrahim speaking to a group of farmers about food security. "Every grain of rice we import is a grain we could have grown ourselves," he said. "Every job we give to foreign companies is a job we could have given to our own people." This message resonated with young Africans who had grown up watching their countries export raw materials while importing finished goods. They began to understand that political independence meant nothing without economic independence. By the end of 2023, the Continental Uprising had reached a tipping point. Even some government officials in various countries were privately expressing support for the Sahel Alliance's approach. In Ghana, several parliament members publicly questioned their government's support for sanctions against Burkina Faso. In Nigeria, state governors began visiting the Sahel countries to explore trade opportunities despite federal government disapproval. The boy from Bondoki village, who had once asked why his country was poor, despite having gold, had accidentally triggered the largest youth movement in Africa since the independence struggles of the 1960s. Today, as the sun rises over Burkina Faso in May 2025, Ibrahim Traore stands on the balcony of his modest presidential palace, looking out at a country that has been transformed. The boy who once watched French trucks carry away his nation's gold now oversees mines that fund schools, hospitals, and roads for his own people. The transformation has been remarkable. Burkina Faso's literacy rate has increased by 40% in just 2.5 years. The country now produces 80% of its own food, compared to 45% before Ibrahim's coup. Most importantly, terrorist attacks have decreased dramatically as the military, working with local communities and alliance partners, has regained control of previously dangerous regions. The alliance of Sahel states has grown stronger and more coordinated. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso now share a common currency, coordinate their defense policies, and negotiate international deals as a unified bloc. What started as 3 isolated countries defying international pressure has become a model that other African nations study carefully. The economic war that was meant to destroy Ibrahim's government has backfired spectacularly. Instead of weakening the Sahel Alliance, the sanctions forced these countries to become more self-reliant and innovative. They developed new technologies, created regional supply chains, and built economic partnerships with countries outside the traditional Western sphere. Even more significantly, the Continental Uprising that Ibrahim accidentally inspired has forced established African leaders to change their approaches. In Senegal, President Sall was eventually forced to negotiate new agreements with France that gave Senegal greater control over its resources. In Ghana, the government announced plans to reduce foreign military presence. Across the continent, the conversation about African independence and self-determination has become impossible to ignore. Some of the same leaders who once tried to intimidate Ibrahim have begun adopting similar policies. General Sekou, who led the delegation that tried to force Ibrahim's compliance, recently announced that Guinea would review all of its mining contracts with foreign companies. Times have changed, General Sekou admitted in a rare interview. Young people will no longer accept leaders who put foreign interests before their own people's welfare. The international community has also been forced to adapt. France, which once dominated West African politics, has had to negotiate new partnerships based on mutual respect rather than historical dominance. Russia and China have increased their engagement with Africa, offering alternatives to traditional Western partnerships. But perhaps the most important change has been in the minds of ordinary Africans. The generation that watched Ibrahim Traore stand up to continental bullying now believes that real change is possible. They have seen that small countries can challenge big powers, that African leaders can put their people first, and that economic independence is achievable with determination and smart policies. In universities across Africa, students study the Burkina Faso model as an example of successful economic transformation. Young entrepreneurs start businesses inspired by Ibrahim's emphasis on local production and self-reliance. Political movements in dozens of countries use Ibrahim's example to demand better governance from their own leaders. The boy who asked his father why they were poor despite having gold has become the man who proved that Africa's poverty was never about lack of resources. It was about lack of leaders willing to put their people first. As Ibrahim walks back into his office to start another day of work, he carries with him the hopes of millions of young Africans who now believe that their continent's best days lie ahead, not behind. The revolution that began in a small West African country has become a continental awakening that will shape Africa's future for generations to come. The generals who once ordered him to obey learned too late that some dreams are too powerful to be stopped by threats or sanctions. Ibrahim Traore's dream of a free and prosperous Africa has become a reality that continues to inspire the world.